and welcome to the fifth and final part of this exploration of collective bargaining and negotiations in the modern workplace. Just to catch up with what we were discussing in the last video, we were focusing then on what happens in the negotiation room, what you can do if it all goes wrong and you need to work out an alternative approach, and what happens next once you've actually reached the conclusion of that collective bargain. So this time what we're moving on to do is to have a look at some case studies, just to have a look at illustrating some of the issues that we've been covering in these last few videos. I'd like to start just by having a look at a couple of examples from the public sector, but it's important to remember when you're talking about the public sector that the context in which those negotiations are taking place. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the potential for the Chancellor to remove pay restraint from public sector pay policy. But it's also worth remembering that pay restraint has been operating at various different levels right back to the Tony Blair government. So it's been there for a very long time. It's been a significant influence over the way negotiations have been done in the public sector for the whole of that period of time, which is a considerable number of years now. The other thing is that the budget cuts that have happened under austerity have also influenced the way negotiations have been played out. Just in terms of the number of redundancies and staffing losses. So the nature of some of the negotiations has been quite different. And of course there's also been a further influence from the Scottish Government making a commitment against compulsory redundancies. So that's been in there influencing things as well. And all of that is illustration of the amount of political influence and what would be termed by some people as interference that happens to all collective bargaining that happens in the public sector. So the first example I would like to have a quick look at is that of the Forestry Commission, which is the government body that licenses felling and planting of trees, does research into forestry operations and various things like that. So, before the Alliance government came into power, there was a pretty constructive relationship going on there. Although there were a number of different branches to the organisation, it was all done through a central bargain, a central table that did all of the negotiations. And the culture was that the management were very open with the unions, and the unions reciprocated by being very open with management. And it was a constructive approach from both sides with the intention of finding some kind of mutually acceptable outcome. That's not to say that there was always agreement. There were a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions, and some genuine negotiation. But the intention was that there was going to be a mutually acceptable outcome. So essentially at a situation where everybody knew what the ground rules were and they all played by them. When the Alliance came to power, well, I suppose you could term it that they changed the ground rules to a large extent. There was a dogmatic approach that the unions were not to be given what's called facility time, which is the time that unions are often given by employers to actually prepare for negotiations that they're going to take part in. But the Alliance government decided that they weren't going to be supportive of that in the public sector any longer. They also put pressure on management to stop sharing some of the information that they had previously been sharing about business operations and the like, which meant that the negotiations took place in a slightly less informed manner than they would otherwise have done. The result of that was basically increasingly fractious negotiations, increasingly irritable relationships between those who were sitting around the table, and that spilt over to all levels of the organisation. It also resulted in a lot of unnecessary reactions to statements that the union were making about campaigns that they were running, or where they were making observations in relation to government policy that were not being necessarily critical of management, but were often taken as such. So the whole political influence on that whole situation resulted in the industrial relationship becoming significantly less functional than it had been before. Moving into a Scottish example, and I thought this would be a useful illustration of the influence that the personalities around a table can have. And it's just looking at the National Galleries of Scotland. And a number of years ago, they were going through a pay and grading review. Now, the key context to this was that they had recently appointed a new Chief Operating Officer who had been drawn in from the private sector. Now, they were an incredibly experienced commercial negotiator, but they'd never operated in a unionised workplace, and they'd never taken part in collective bargaining, which meant that they misunderstood a lot of the things that were being said to them and misinterpreted the approaches that the unions were trying to take. Similarly, the language that they were using was not language that the unions that were negotiating were familiar with. So there was a lot of miscommunication, which resulted in some serious fallings out across the table. At the same time, it wasn't helped that from those who were already at the table before the Chief Operating Officer arrived, there were already a number of personality clashes where particular negotiators on both sides would just bristle when their counterparts started speaking. Didn't matter what they were saying, and that got in the way of reaching any sort of agreement or making any real progress. And in the end, we were actually only able to reach some kind of settlement in that case because ACAS came in and did a conciliation that allowed us to agree on a BATNA. So it wasn't a formalised agreement, but the BATNA was imposed and the unions opted not to object to that. So in the context of governmental pay restraints and everything that was going on at the time, that was as positive as we could have expected to have got to. Not quite, but almost by way of contrast, I'd like to have a quick look at the James Hutton Research Institute. Now, they were similarly affected by austerity, and as a result of that ran into a number of financial difficulties that meant they needed to cut their costs, as in cut their outgoings, while also working out ways of making additional income. As soon as the Institute realised that they needed to find some kind of solution to the problems that they were facing, they made early contact with the union, and as a result we entered into some constructive dialogue about what could be done to try and identify solutions to the problem. The result of that were some suggestions from the staff as to alternative approaches to raising money and different places where they could actually look to raise contracts. But the outcome was significantly fewer redundancies than we'd all feared that might have to be put into place. And all of the people who went did so voluntarily. So they actually opted to take a package and go and do something else. And it fitted with what they wanted to do. And ultimately the organisation returned to stability and balance and is now moving on quite positively. Moving into the private sector and continuing in a kind of similar vein, I'd just like to have a look at the case of Air Contractors Engineering, which was an aircraft maintenance company operating in Edinburgh. And they ran into a serious operational problem which was threatening the company with going out of business. So again, they made early contact, which resulted in constructive dialogue that allowed them to actually enter into a genuine redundancy consultation process. Now, where that led was actually quite surprising for them, in that the result was that some of the staff identified a new business model which allowed them to continue trading, and that meant that 14 of the jobs were saved by this Phoenix business that came out of the situation. For the other 21 staff who were there, they were either redeployed within the group of companies that they were part of, which was part of the consultation, or actually employed by other similar employers who were technically competitors, but who were canvassed to see whether they needed people with the skills that these people actually had. Now, as a result of that, not only were the redundancy costs massively lower than they were fearing, they can manage to, as a business, continue trading, but they now have such a good reputation from the way that they treated staff in that situation that when they have vacancies, they have an oversubscription of people who want to come and work for them. So some serious positive outcomes from trying to take a positive approach into that interaction between management and staff. And I'd just like to finish off by looking very briefly at a few examples just to show some of the different approaches that can be taken in different organisations. And I'm not going to go into these in any great depth. Firstly, I'd like to touch on the systems operator for Northern Ireland, who operate in the energy supply sector over there. And it's really just to flag up that because there's a different employment law structure and tribunal system, etc., things operate slightly differently. So when we were undertaking pay negotiations there, and we were running into basically a bit of a deadlock, we're unable to get anywhere, but we drew in the Labour Relations Agency, who undertook a process very similar to conciliations that ACAS would do in Great Britain, but they managed to get us through to a point where we achieved a settlement out of that. I'd just like to then compare the approaches taken with two of the Scottish energy companies as well, Scottish Power and Scottish and Southern Energy. With Scottish Power, their approach is to put you all up in a hotel, and essentially you're there until you finish negotiating. So it can be a bit of a war of attrition at points, but it's also a way to ensure that the negotiations don't drag on. They're completed within 2 to 3 days, and at the end of it, ideally, well, in all of the cases where I was, we came away with a mutually acceptable solution, and not one that ended up having to be imposed. Unlike that, in Scottish and Southern Energy, the negotiations take place over a series of meetings. They tend to be more in the kind of towards the harder end of negotiation, so it's more of a horse trade. And there then needs to be a bit of work done about making sure that you trust each other enough in order to actually trade in a way that doesn't result in too many arguments. Again, which was generally achieved. And just to finish off, it's not always polite, it's not always friendly, and I can only say that when I was involved with BAE Systems shipbuilding yard on the Clyde, a lot of the language that used was not what you would describe as parliamentary, and it was a bit of an eye-opener for me as to how things can go, with a bit of table thumping and some very, very traditional trade unionism going on there. Now, that's a fairly unusual model nowadays, but it's interesting to see that there are pockets of industry where it still exists. So I suppose the key take-home message from all of that is that it's not one size fits all. There are a number of different options available, and it's a question of finding the one that fits for you and your negotiation and your structure the best.